All right, we're going to start with some numbers. According to Pew Research, 52% of Americans are more concerned about artificial intelligence than they are excited about it. 75% of Americans believe healthcare will move too fast using AI without fully understanding its impacts. 67% of Americans are concerned that the government will not go far enough in regulating chatbots like ChatGPT. So technology, and how many of us actually really like self-checkouts at the supermarket? Has anybody noticed that prices have dropped since supermarkets are starting to use them? Everyone today seems a bit nervous about technology. We're all wondering if innovation really does lead to progress, and we're wondering if technology is making just a few people a lot richer, too. Maybe the debate shouldn't actually be about, for example, ChatGPT, but about how we use it or about who chooses how we use it. So what is the real nexus of power and progress? How very fortunate that Daron Acemoglu, the author of the book with that very title, is here to help us understand. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Chat and Chowder. We're delighted that you're joining us, whether you're in the room or on the Zoom. My name is Mary Eintema, and I'm president of World Boston. Few reminders, as you may know, the mission of World Boston is to foster international engagement and global cooperation. So thank you for taking part in this mission. Right away, we thank our hosts at Foley and Lardner for their kind hospitality. A partner, James DeVellis, who happens to be our board chair, is here. So thank you, James, and your colleagues. And thank you to Natalie Mace, our Director of Global Engagement Programs, who's in the back doing everything to make this event happen, along with other great World Boston colleagues. So World Boston staff and board members, raise your hands if anyone has questions, including Noelle back there. If anyone has questions, please do talk to us, even if you don't have questions. Of course, we want to thank the Lowell Institute, which generously supports Chat and Chowder and Great Decisions and our annual State of the State Department program. Their support makes it possible for you to be at all of our regular monthly programs for free, which is actually amazing. It is amazing. So free of charge does not mean free of cost. These programs take a lot of resources. Supporting World Boston at $25 and above will get you this very stylish pin, as well as recognition in our 2024 Circle of Community Sponsors. You can donate to World Boston tax deductible at any time on our website, or there's a QR code on many of the tables. There's one right there next to Henry. You can scan it and think how much you might spend on refreshments in some other setting. Anyway, thank you for supporting our mission. Next, we have really quite a run of wonderful events coming up. February 29th, we look forward to our next Great Decisions program on high seas treaties with Dr. Stephen Wills of the Center for Maritime Strategy. May not strike you as front page news, but believe us, this is key right now in trade, global conflict, and more. So we hope you can join us there. Note that a different venue. We're going to be at the GBH Studios in Brighton, not at the Boston Public Library. Looking ahead to March, more great programs. March 19th, another Great Decisions. This is big. Back at the library on pandemic preparedness. We're delighted to host Matt McKnight of Ginkgo Bioworks and Ashish Jha, former White House COVID-19 response coordinator. So that is, must-see TV, as they say. And the following week, we'll be back here for Chat and Chowder on Tyranny of the Minority with Harvard professors Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. You can learn more and register for all of these things on our website or by using the QR codes on the little handouts. Okay, so moving to housekeeping. When we turn to audience Q&A, please raise your hand, and when I call on you, one of my colleagues will bring you a microphone. We'll try to take several questions also from our Zoom audience. Please submit your questions to the Zoom Q&A box, and our staff will pick a few to read out loud. By the way, apologies in advance if you see me using my phone. It's so I can stay in touch with my colleagues. And now, at very long last, tonight's program, we are thrilled to be joined by Doron Adjemolu. He is an institute professor at MIT, and I'm condensing his amazing bio, which I hope you'll read in full. He's an elected fellow of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, the British Academy of Sciences, and many others. He is also a member of the Group of 30. He is co-author of 6 books, including his previous book, the New York Times bestseller, Why Nations Fail: Power, Prosperity, and Poverty. He has received numerous awards and honors, including, just to mention a couple, the T.W. Schultz Prize from the University of Chicago, and honorary doctorates from the University of Utrecht, Bosphorus University, and many others. So that is the wrong way. Beg your pardon. Professor Adjemolu, welcome to World Boston. Thank you for being with us.
I am delighted to have an opportunity to talk about power and progress with you. And as Mary introduced, we are in the midst of some disruptive technologies, whether it's a technological revolution, whether it's a technological transition, nobody knows yet. But there are reasons to be worried, so I'm not going to tell you that we shouldn't worry. In fact, I would say that this is a unique time of opportunities and challenges. And if we are not worried the right way, that means we're not taking responsibility for dealing with these challenges. And in particular, I think there is a broadly optimistic reading of many technological transitions that is part and parcel of the American psyche, that we are generally optimistic when it comes to technologies. There is a sort of a narrative that things are going to work out, and economically, new technologies, if they increase productivity, they're going to create benefits for others. After all, if we really want to generate something approaching shared prosperity, and I'll show you our track record in terms of shared prosperity in a second, then it must be that new technologies somehow trickle down to generate benefits for workers. And indeed, in economics, there is a general belief that there is something that Simon Johnson and I call the productivity bandwagon. We had to come up with a name for it because even though this is a very common belief in economics, it wasn't christened. So we kind of came up with it. Productivity bandwagon says, technology improves, our capabilities improve. That increases productivity, how much output you generate with a worker. And somehow there are enough automatic economic forces that are going to lead to workers also benefiting from it, both in terms of wages and working conditions. Mm-hmm. But actually, there is a big leap here. And that leap has become even more consequential in the age of AI. There are really 2 conditions hidden in the transitioning from that green circle to the red circle. One is that somehow once productivity increases, firms want to employ more workers. And second, when they want to employ more workers, they're going to try to attract these workers by paying higher wages. And that doesn't sound like a crazy supposition, but it turns out that when you look at history, there are periods in which productivity bandwagon works, and there are periods in which it patently strongly fails. So we need to understand why it fails, why it worked, and what we can do to make it work. So here are 2 examples that will illustrate one reason why it fails. It may fail because employers want to hire more labor because labor is more productive, but they actually have other means of doing that. And in particular, if you are in an environment in which workers don't have enough voice, don't have enough power, there are all sorts of ways in which you can try to extract more from labor without paying them more. So here are 2 really phenomenal technological breakthroughs. The first one is the windmill. The Middle Ages are sometimes referred to as Dark Ages, and there's a good reason for that. They were dark for most people that did not have a very good living standards, and they were under repressive relationships. But actually, they weren't technologically backward. There were many important technological breakthroughs, but one stands out really as a phenomenal change in how all production was organized: windmills that massively made it easier to use energy. So you would expect, if the productivity bandwagon worked, that somehow the windmill is going to create benefits for for peasants, for workers. In fact, nothing of the sort seems to have happened. Why? Because the windmills were embedded in a society in which labor was locked into feudal servile relationships, and the windmills were monopolized by a small elite, the clergy, the high clergy, and the aristocracy, that actually coerce people to use their windmills at the prices that they chose, and if they wanted to get more labor out of workers, they didn't have to pay them more because the workers were tied to the land. The one on the left is an equally important gadget. It's Eli Whitney's cotton gin. Eli Whitney's was one of several cotton gins that were invented around the same time, 1790s, and they enabled the U.S. South, which was essentially economically somewhat backward at the time, to become the largest producer and exporter of cotton. So the British Industrial Revolution, which I'll talk about, was at first was a textile revolution, and that textile revolution was fueled by cotton exported from the US South, which became the world's biggest producer and exporter of cotton. Now, you might think that something like this, which created tremendous wealth and tremendous increase in productivity, should be good for the workers if the productivity bandwagon worked. Of course, that's not what happened because, again, this production relationship was embedded in a very coercive environment, this time even worse than medieval slavery, medieval serfdom, slavery. So the workers who were producing cotton were the black enslaved people, and they, of course, were locked into this relationship, and their employers didn't have to pay them higher wages, for example, to move them to the deep south where most of the cotton plantations were. The working conditions for the slaves worsened. Their real incomes don't seem to have increased while other people benefited. So the first lesson then, we really need the right institutional setup. Power matters, and that's why power is in the title of the book. If power is monopolized in the hands of a small group, that's not going to be a recipe for shared prosperity or for other types of gains to be spread around. But you might think these are all history, and recent times, for example, spearheaded by the Industrial Revolution and the advent of industrial machinery, are going to be different. And it turns out not so much. First of all, the Industrial Revolution, which started sometime around in the middle of the 18th century, was also in a context in which employers had a lot of power, workers were very disorganized, and in fact, they were not even allowed to form labor organizations. But more importantly, when you look at the history of the Industrial Revolution, you see something very different than the the optimistic read that you sometimes hear in today's discussions of technology and prosperity, that there's nothing to worry about AI and digital technologies because things have worked out in the past. Look at the Industrial Revolution. Yes, indeed. Today we are hugely more comfortable, prosperous, healthy than people who lived in the 1700s, and that is largely or partly due to the Industrial Revolution, but it didn't feel that way to the people who lived, say, for the first 100 years of the Industrial Revolution from 1750 to around 1850. Why? Their real incomes declined or remained stagnant, their working hours extended, their working conditions worsened under much more disciplinarian conditions, but there is more than just repression that was going on. A very important part of the story was that a lot of the machinery that was introduced at the early stages of the British Industrial Revolution is what we today call automation machinery, which means that they automated tasks that previously were performed by skilled artisans or sometimes semi-skilled artisans, such as spinners. And as a result, they eliminated work and they sidelined workers. So for example, a lot of that cotton, where did it go? So it went to weaving machines. So you would expect the weavers actually benefited, but the real wages of weavers throughout England fell by about 30 to 40% during this period. Why? Because now you could perform the same work more cheaply. And that highlights another aspect of what we need for the productivity bandwagon. We need that technologies don't just improve productivity, but they also increase what labor is used for. And in particular, what I'm going to emphasize, labor needs to be used centrally in the production process. If all technological progress targets increasing automation, it's not going to be useful. Now, that might actually come as a surprise to some of you because you may have heard other economists saying, well, if productivity increases, that's going to be good for labor ultimately. Well, to understand that, perhaps I can use a story that's or a parable that's often repeated, well, sometimes by people who think technology is going to be liberating, sometimes by people who think technology is going to be a pathway to dystopia. But the story is, you might have heard of it. It says the modern factory is going to have two employees, a man and a dog. The man is there to feed the dog, and the dog is there so that the man doesn't touch the equipment. So imagine, whether you like that factory or not, I don't know. I think it's concerning for many reasons, but imagine we have a factory just like that, or perhaps approximating that. Imagine that the machinery gets better, twice as productive. Now, what's happening to labor productivity, or the average way in which we're generating output? It's doubled. If you look at productivity per worker, we have one employee and a huge amount of output. It is now doubled. That's great. But of course, the humorous part of the story is that that man is not very useful, nor is his dog. So factories are not going to rush to hire more people or more dogs when the equipment gets better. So if we live in a world like that, technological improvements are not going to generate a pathway to prosperity. I want to also emphasize that all of this is embedded in broader social relations. These two pictures, I think, are symbolic of the early 19th century. And they show, on the left, it's Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon, famous from Michel Foucault's writings, or The Guardians of the Galaxy, whichever one you prefer. But it's a symbol of the fact that information was central during the Industrial Revolution, but it was about who controls information. So the Panopticon was the apex of that. Jeremy Bentham thinking, how can I empower the people, the bosses? This was for a factory first and then for prisons. How can I empower bosses to have even more information and control it? And the Panopticon wasn't adopted, but many similar devices were adopted because monitoring workers was a central part of it. Again, we're going to see this coming up in the context of AI. And then the left is, unless the public sector plays an important role, working, living conditions can get very bad. So it wasn't only that British, English workers weren't benefiting so greatly from the industrialization process. It was also that they came to live in urban cities where working conditions were horrible. Pollution, endemic, uncontrolled diseases, life expectancy at the beginning of the 19th century for people in London may have fallen, or Manchester may have fallen, to as low as 30 years at birth. So, but perhaps this too is history. Perhaps today we don't have to worry about all of this. After all, we are ruled by enlightened politicians and enlightened technological elites. The Economist magazine never tires of telling us that people in Silicon Valley are working for the betterment of society. So perhaps we don't have to worry about any of these. And yes and no. There are some differences and not. And I think this picture here is just a very quick summary of some of the differences, but some of the same patterns that we are seeing here again. What I'm showing here is the real wages of 10 demographic groups in the United States, distinguished by gender, left men, right women, and education level, going all the way from people with a high school, without a high school degree in orange, high school degree in green, associate degrees or some college black, just a college degree in light blue, and people with postgraduate degrees in dark blue. Everything is normalized to zero, so you can look from 1963 onwards, the cumulative changes in the real wages. And these are all inflation adjusted, so there are real incomes. So you see a pattern in the from 1963 to the mid-1970s that's actually even more strongly true in the 1950s from other data sources, which I'm not showing here for brevity. There was a period of shared prosperity. Real wages increased in tandem for all these demographic groups. Some of them you cannot see because they're on top of each other. So pretty much all of these demographic groups enjoyed about 2.5% increase in real wages every year, which means that if you start your life as a worker and keep that job with 2.5% wage increase, in 20 years' time, your income essentially has doubled. So that's a really remarkable form of gains for the working people and a shared form of it. But you see that from around 1980 onwards, the digital age, you have a sea change. These curves are opening up, but even more jarringly, the low education groups are experiencing real wage declines. So there's about a 20% lower wages for high school educated or high school dropout men today than it was in 1980. And you have no other period since data since we have comparable data where we see in any industrialized country, 40-year period in which real incomes for such broad education groups or for such groups, essentially about half of the population are declining. This, of course, has many reasons: globalization, offshoring, changes in union power and social norms. But it is not just a US phenomenon. You see stagnant incomes for low wage workers in many other countries, and overall inequality, for example, measured by the Gini index, has increased in many countries around the world as well. Although US has always been a leader in inequality, at least in over the last 80 years or so, and has a very large increase in inequality, and no other country has had as big a decline at the bottom of the distribution. So US experience is informatively unique. So to understand this picture, we have to understand its two parts separately. The first is, how is it that the US, actually not just the US, but many other industrialized nations, achieved shared prosperity early on from around 1948, 49 to the mid-1970s, and then why did it come apart? And this is actually very similar. The answer is very similar if I also ask the complementary question of how come the first 100 years of the Industrial Revolution were so bad, and things, how did they improve around 1850? The answer to both of them is very related to these conditions that I explained for the productivity bandwagon. Workers acquired more voice and power, and the direction of technology changed, in particular in making humans more vital for the production process. And let me tell the story for the US, since we are in the United States. So here is one example of what the production process looked like at the beginning of the 20th century. This is from one of the first electrified factories of Henry Ford. Henry Ford was very cost conscious, not a big friend of labor, and very intent on doing mass production, which meant using mechanized production, automation, and so on. He was a leader in introducing electric power, decentralized electric power, interchangeable part system, and then the assembly line. And you can see that, you can see the assembly line, you can see all the electrical machinery, but you see something else that's very important. Workers, lots of workers engaged in technical tasks. The early automobile industry is a exemplar of how automation can go hand in hand, while at the same time of training more workers, introducing more skilled work, more technical work, more inspection, maintenance, repair work. And actually what you don't see here is that this was supported by a back office that was getting bigger and bigger. Lots of clerical workers doing accounts and planning and things like that. So this was a great example of what we would call new tasks, meaning new human tasks, by providing better information, better expertise, better technical capabilities. And that was the reason why, while Henry Ford himself made a lot of money, the auto industry grew in terms of employment, perhaps by about tenfold from the early 20th century to just before World War II. But it wasn't just technology. The direction of technology, the fact that it went in a pro-human direction was important, but worker voice was important as well. The auto industry was also at the forefront of world labor organization. This is the UAW, not against Ford, but against GM in the sit-down strike. But both GM and Ford had to make a lot of concessions to labor because labor was getting organized. First, the concessions came in terms of working conditions, wages, but also labor, when it was organized and had its head screwed right, also worked with these companies to use technology well and to use technology in a pro-worker way. So, for example, UAW sometimes went off the rails and did exactly the wrong things, but when it was doing the right things, what it was pushing for is create more skilled work, more training, more expertise. We want the machines to be working with workers, and that was central. So why then things fell apart? Well, by this point, you can guess both of these pillars of shared prosperity, both of the pillars of what we require to make the productivity bandwagon came apart. So the first is that in the digital age, we focus too much on automation. So here is the equivalent car factory of today. You see even more advanced robot arms and machinery, wonderful, but you don't see the workers anywhere. Was this one chap here. He doesn't seem to be anything. He just stands his head. Perhaps he's a supervisor. Perhaps he's somebody else. But there aren't many workers performing the sort of inspection, design, technical work that you see in the early factory. Too much focus on automation. Is that really important relative to other factors? Well, my work has focused on this, and and try to make this case. So in particular, in work that I've done with my Boston University colleague, Pasquale Restrepo, we've tried to show that excessive focus on automation has been a major part of the inequality and the decline in the wages for low education workers in the United States. So here is one figure summarizing that. If you give me the permission to explain it to you, what I'm doing here is I'm looking at more disaggregated demographic groups, not just distinguished by gender and education, ethnicity and age. And the color coding again tells you the education of the group, which is relevant when you eyeball it. And on the vertical axis, I am focusing on the cumulative wage change from 1980 to 2016, 2017, that key period where we saw the inequality explode and the wages at the bottom falling. You can see exactly the same. Many groups are losing out from economic growth pattern because zero is there, and many of these circles are below zero. These are the groups that whose real wage is declining from 1980 to 2016, 2017. But the key is the horizontal axis. That's Pasquale and my measure of how much automation that demographic group has been subjected to. You can think of it as what fraction of tasks that group used to perform in 1980 that have since been automated. So for some low education groups, for some high school graduates, high school dropouts, and actually for some groups with associate degrees, that's like 15, 20% of the task. So that's a big deal. And in fact, you can see it's a big deal because much of the increase in inequality is explained with this automation measure, and especially those groups that have really fallen off the wagon are the ones that have been subjected to a lot of this automation. But it wasn't just technology. First of all, we choose technology. Technology is chosen in an environment that's embedded in particular power relations and changing power relations. And also, again, who gains and who loses is very much related to how wages are negotiated, how they are bargained. So within that context, there were several, but two institutional changes that I would like to particularly point out. One is that labor became less powerful. There was a period of the unionization that goes back to the 1970s, but with Ronald Reagan firing the striking professional air traffic controllers in 1981, there was a turning point, and many private companies also followed Reagan and took a much harsher line on labor unions, and you see union membership and union power, as well as strike activity decline quite sharply around the 1980s, 1990s. But also the vision, the ideology of powerful actors, especially chief executive officers, top managers, leaders of the industry started changing. I think you cannot blame this on one single individual, but a symbol of it is an economist famous to many of you, Milton Friedman, who wrote many important papers and books, but he is most famous for something he wrote in the New York Times Magazine, where he argued that we should not worry about social responsibility. The only social responsibility of business is to increase its profits, he argued in the New York Times. He was channeling ideas that were already in the air, but he really pushed them, and he trained, and especially people who were aligned with him, trained many people in business schools who started applying this as a management philosophy. What that means is two things. First of all, if you are going to make a lot of money, but you can cut wages at the same time, you're going to do that. So that doesn't help workers. But also, it makes these managers very open to technologies that automate work, because in the short run, if you want to boost profits, one good way of doing that is reduce your costs, and a very major part of your costs are labor costs. So if you can sideline labor, that's actually good. Now, these are things we should have worried about in 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010, but this is the right time to worry even more because we are in the midst of these transformative AI technology. And you may be concerned, and you would be right to be concerned, that AI is going to be just another salvo making workers more impoverished. Yes, I'm really worried about that. And in fact, I think that's the path that we're going to. But I want to also point out that there are different ways of using AI. In the same way that Henry Ford's factories could use electrical machinery, not just to sideline labor, but also create new tasks for labor and make a nice buck on the side, there is a way for businesses to use AI in a way that's more pro-worker, in a way that actually creates better information, better capabilities for workers. And Is this what businesses are doing right now? Not necessarily, not at all, actually. But there are proof of concept studies that show that. So 3 studies in 3 different settings show that this is actually possible. So a paper that looks at the GitHub Copilot, which provides basic routines for programmers in the most common languages such as Java or Python. If you give access to programmers to this, it's like a semi-automation tool. It's not a full automation tool. Why? Because the program GPT-4 or ChatGPT is not going to write programs by itself. They're full of bugs. But they can write a template, and then good programmers or semi-skilled programmers can build on it and improve it. And that's what they do. And they can perform tasks twice as fast, and the quality goes up by 20 to 30%. 2 PhD students of ours at MIT, Shaket Noy and Whitney Zhang, do the same thing for simple writing, summarizing tasks for white-collar clerical workers. And what you see is an improvement for people who get access to the ChatGPT. But even more interestingly, the people who benefit are those who are having trouble. So it's actually an equalizing task, equalizing technology, that if I'm the best writer for this task, I don't need the help of ChatGPT, but some people who are not so good might get that help. And the paper by Erik Brynjolfsson, Danielle Lee, and Lindsay Raymond shows the same thing for customer service. But unfortunately, that's not where we are going. And we're not going there because we are using these technologies in a very different way. And I think this cannot be understood without recognizing the profit incentives, but also without seeing how the tech industry works. And I'm going to conclude. I have just 3 more slides, and I'll conclude with that. The first one is that, as I've already highlighted, there are economic incentives for automation. There are economic incentives for information control. But also there's an ideology in the tech industry that goes back to this brilliant mathematician, Alan Turing, which said that the purpose of digital computers should be autonomous machine intelligence, self-acting machines achieving human capabilities. Well, that's one way to conceptualize what digital tools can do, but it's a rather narrow and peculiar way. But somehow we have sort of swallowed that hook, line, and sinker. One implication of it is that if you think that where we're heading is better and better machines that are self-acting and are autonomous, automation becomes a corollary. It hasn't always been that way. Many other thinkers have articulated different ways of thinking about machines. And in fact, when this was practiced, not today, not in today's Silicon Valley, but when it was practiced in the past, it was very important. So Norbert Wiener, an MIT mathematician and engineer, articulated some of these ideas, which Simon Johnson and I call in the book machine usefulness rather than machine intelligence. And people like Douglas Engelbart and JCR Licklider turned them into actual technologies. Many of the things that you depend on today came out of this machine usefulness perspective. The computer mouse, hypertext, hyperlink, menu-driven computers, and the internet. So let me then talk finally about 2 things, and then I will conclude. One is that the problem is not just economic. Actually, the economic problem, as I've pointed out, is embedded in power relations, but the power relations are becoming very lopsided in the age of AI. Digital technologies were already used as monitoring tools, but AI is threatening to take it to the next stage because it creates a more monopolized control of information. And it also creates better tools for manipulation. This is something that actually Hannah Arendt, a scholar of totalitarianism, anticipated about 40 years ago when she wrote that the problem is not that people will believe the lies, but in the age of everybody lies, nobody will believe anything any longer. But if nobody believes anything any longer, that's an ideal ground for authoritarianism and one in which democracy cannot survive. So what we argue in the book is that we need to change the narrative. Technology needs democratic control, so it's not just between Sam Altman and Elon Musk, and it requires countervailing powers. Countervailing powers come from government regulation. That's why it was so important that in Britain, all of this was embedded, for example, with public works and government policies changing. It requires labor organization, and it requires civil society action. Today, we wouldn't have half of the regulations that we have for customer safety if it wasn't for civil society action in the United States. And it requires redirection of technological change. Many people in the past, not just the names that I showed you, believe that computers could be used for empowering more people. They haven't proven to be right, but that's because of the choices that we've made. We can make different choices that create better tasks, better roles for better information for workers and better information and better participation possibilities for citizens. And there is a template for doing that. There are some policies and there are some broader institutional ideas that we discuss in the book, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A part. Thank you very much.
Economics has changed a lot since I was in school. Wow. Okay, so we are going to do a couple of questions. I'm going to take a couple at a minute. I'm going to start with you in the back corner there. Where's my friend?
I have two quick questions. One, on your graph.
If it's possible to do one, just because I know there's going to be a ton.
I'm going to make it real quick.
All right.
On your graph, Greece is the only one that went the other way. I don't see any prosperity in Greece. In fact, there is a lot more prosperity here. A second question, yes, you're right. The weaving process or whatever they called did not make labor's life better, but the clothes become so much cheaper that everybody could afford it.
Okay, thank you.
Well, of course, there are idiosyncratic factors in each country. Greece during that period had big labor unrest, and that's part of the reason why inequality fell. But more importantly, what I'm showing you in everything here are real wages. So when products become cheaper, that's already in here. So for example, when you look in the United States to high school educated workers, it's not their nominal wages that are falling, but they're so much better off because they can buy cheap stuff from Walmart. It's their real wages that are falling.
Mary, thanks.
Okay, with all the use of AI, I'm actually in technology. With all of the use of AI, isn't it still true that you need to have good and accurate data with things like basically, for example, addresses?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one, there's so many issues that we need to talk about if we get more into AI, and one is data, and the industry has distorted incentives because partly data is so important, but data is not priced. So a future market structure will need to have data markets and much better data privacy and data rights. And that's both for distributional reasons and also for generating incentives for better data quality. So I think one part of the issue of ChatGPT is that it's trained on Reddit. So what do you expect if something is trained on Reddit? So ChatGPT has great insights on certain things. Where does it come from? Some of it comes from New York Times, some of it comes from Wikipedia, some of it comes from books. It learned how to program. How did it learn how to program? Because there's a wonderful website called Stack Overflow where people actually ask specific questions about how to write better routines. And that's the website that it rated and wrote all the information. But once large language models start doing that, those websites close down. Like Stack Overflow is essentially dead now. So we need better quality data that still protects the privacy of people. So that's one of the issues that you need to really create a better institutional structure.
All right, I'm actually going to ask a question because I'm standing here with a mic. I just want to make sure that we understand. You talk about automation doesn't do much unless you're creating new tasks. Please explain why that is different from make work. I spent a lot of time in formerly communist countries back in the day, and you would have 25 people standing around and looking at a hammer. So that doesn't increase well-being. So how are these different ideas?
Perfect. Thank you for asking that. Well, I will need to get a little bit in greater detail, but in creating new tasks, new human tasks is different both from A, make work, and B, from making workers more productive. And let me try to explain both of them. First of all, make work, it won't help unless you're creating new tasks. Why? Because I have one computer, the computer can do exactly the same thing. One worker was using it. Now I get 7 workers to use it 1/7 of the time each. That's not going to help the working people. It may make work spread more thinly, more broadly, but it's not going to create greater incentives for firms to hire more labor and to pay them more. Secondly, you might think that all we need to do is make workers more productive. For example, we could provide just a little bit better education to workers, and that's going to solve the problem. That by itself won't solve the problem if workers become more skilled and perform the same tasks. Why? Because it will make those tasks really abundant and it will make them much cheaper. So today we have many more taxi cab drivers in London, but they're doing exactly the same thing as the previous taxi cab drivers are doing. So cabs are cheaper, taxi cab drivers are not earning more. New tasks means you're actually creating new ways of adding value for workers. And once that's the case, firms will want to hire more workers because it's central for their survival and flourishment. So that's the key. So what the Ford factories did is that they created these new tasks that were central. So if they didn't hire the workers, they couldn't produce the cars. And then it wasn't just Ford, but GM then built on that and did even more of it. So it's all the ecosystem creating more dependence on labor.
So are we back to Economics 101, where you're talking about more capital-intensive production?
No, it's not more capital-intensive production. But let me not get into more of the details.
Fine.
Because,
never mind.
Again, capital, you can use it for automation. You can use it just working workers more productive, or you can use it for more new tasks.
Okay. We have someone on Zoom. So Naz is going to read the Zoom question.
All right, this question is from Steve Powell. Your thesis reminds me of Neil Postman's contrast of technopoly versus what he called tool-using culture. What would you propose should exist outside of the market to enable Americans as a society to decide democratically to use these technologies?
Yes, I think Neil Postman had very prescient ideas about how we can misuse technology. I don't think he developed fully as well how we could use technology well. So in some sense, we are building on his insights, but we're trying to push that more, both in the context of the production process, the new task, but also in the context of the democratic control. But I would say you have to think of the market process and the non-market channels as complements, not as substitutes. So there has not been many, there aren't many examples of societies that have created the type of shared prosperity that don't use markets. But the question is, how do you use market? What types of markets and who controls both the markets and the technology? So I think the democratic control is particularly important for the direction of technology. And once we have the right direction of technology, the market process can work better, which is what we saw not just in the United States, and throughout the industrialized world, in Europe, in Japan, later on in South Korea, during the 60s, 70s, 80s, in Korea, actually going back into much more into the 90s after the fall of the dictatorship and 2000s. And in all of these examples, the market system needed to be helped by the right technological choices. But then once the technology was in place, the market system, with some problems, worked well. Monopoly always remains a problem. Korea, for example, has always had sometimes conflictual relationships between capital and labor, but the nexus of the problem is, again, getting the technology right.
Okay, yeah, let's go to Brandon here, and then we'll go over to Martin, I think, just to spread it around the room. So let's do two questions at once to save some time, okay?
It's a really amazing talk, and I'm really looking forward to reading the book. I just wanted to ask a question about, there's this school of thought in the law and the political economy that sort of contemplates the role of the law in the creation of shared prosperity and the eventual dissolution of that. And I'm interested in sort of how you see that change, that sort of inflection point around the 80s you showed in that graph, of a differing sort of social contract between the state and citizens versus state and the market, and how do you see that sort of playing a role there?
Okay, so shall we try and get the second question so that we can, because I have a feeling there's going to be a lot of discussion post programs. We want to save time for that and buying books. So Martin, your question to take us home.
So in my understanding of why nations fail, there's a central role for systems and institutions. In a fourth industrial revolution world, are our current institutions and systems up to the task?
Perfectly. I think both of these questions are actually quite complementary. Yes, why nations fail put the emphasis on power and institutions, but what it didn't emphasize so much is the direction of technology, how we use technology. And how we use technology is a very important battleground for the struggles over institutions, and it also requires different sets of institutions. So to regulate AI, we of course need new laws, we of course need new institutions, and I think that's exactly the answer to your question, Brandon, which is that the market system doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists embedded in laws, it exists embedded in broader institutions, it exists embedded in the relationship between firms and workers and civil society. And all of these things have changed over the last 60 years. And some of them have been good changes, but many of them have weakened labor and have increased the power of large businesses. And this gentleman, who just happens to be up there, was one of a group of computer scientists in the late 60s and early 70s who thought that personal computers would decentralize power and make the regular person strong against companies and the small workers better capable of standing up for themselves. They all thought that IBM was the problem, and once you broke the monopoly of IBM, personal computer would become a liberating tool. Of course, IBM's monopoly wasn't broken, but now we have Microsoft, Facebook, Google, and so many other companies that are even more powerful than IBM in controlling information. So I think there was some grain of truth in what they were thinking about, but the institutional framework and the direction of technology didn't go their way. So that's why I had him up here.
All right. Very last question. Ed is like boiling over here. Sorry.
Thank you very much for the talk. I have to take issue with it. Do you think communication
in the form of a question?
In the form of a question, do you think communication has been improved by technology? How that has helped people? Real quickly, I used to lived in Europe in the 80s. Calling home, hi mom, I love you. Bye. Click. It cost me $10. Now it's free, and people can reach each other in a way. They can organize, and not always for the good. I agree, but they can organize it away. The Arab Spring, it could not have happened without the technology we have. So that has helped.
I think it has both helped and hampered. So just like these gentlemen here, many people thought that Twitter, Facebook, and social media were going to be liberating tools, and they have made it cheaper for people to access. There is evidence that shows that, you know, Facebook facilitates small businesses in the developing world enter into big markets. But on the other hand, there's also overwhelming evidence that all of social media has been used as a manipulative tool. There are many studies that show the negative mental health effects of social media, and the internet social media type of tools have been much more successfully used by authoritarian governments like China, increasingly Russia and Iran, and to some degree also the United States at times, to snoop on its citizens and extinguish dissent. So it's about how you use them, but the lowest the easiest path for the companies to make money has often been, you know, let's take people's data and let's try to monetize that, for example, with digital ads. Well, how can we make digital ads more profitable? By making people more manipulated. So that dynamic, I think, needs to be broken. So some part of the law and policy is really about breaking that. But I think as tools, they are amazing tools. We can communicate much better. And there are examples. Taiwan actually provides some excellent examples of this. They are discussed in the book. I'm not going to go into the details, where you can use internet, AI, and social media-like things for pro-democracy reasons. So it is possible, but that's not the path we have chosen.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, Doron Ajemoglu, thank you so very much. Wow.
Thank you.
And let's hear it for World Boston. I love the questions. What a great group. All right, so now we're going to sell books, and we're here till 7:30. Thank you for coming. See you very soon on February 29th.